Good evening. I am Ella Lacey, president of the local Carbondale branch of the of the AAUW, the American Association of University Women. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone to this monthly program of our branch, our November event. This program, like almost all of our programs, have in mind not only branch members, but the general public as well. We encourage questions of the speaker. You may, from the audience, you may insert them in the Q&A or in the chat box. Dr. Linda Flowers will moderate the questions after the speaker. We hope you will keep the questions coming in as you formulate them. Before we get to the featured program for this evening, I have asked one of our long-serving and very dedicated members to tell you a few special things about AAUW. That person is Dr. Martha Ellert. Martha?
Good evening, and welcome to all of you from me as well. About AAUW, as Ella said, it is the American Association of University Women, but we use the abbreviation. It is a very old organization and at the same time, very much up to the minute, weighing in on issues relating to gender equity. In the time of its existence, the organization has published hundreds of research reports, from an 1885 paper which disproved a prevailing myth that college impairs a woman's fertility, to most recently, a study that documents the economic impact of sexual harassment in the workplace. AAUW has supported the academic achievements of many thousands of scholars, from scientist Marie Curie to astronaut Judith Resnick, and many more. AAUW's advocacy has propelled countless new laws, working tirelessly for their passage, including the Equal Pay Act, first proposed in 1945, finally passed in 1963, the Title IX Amendment in 1972, the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1993, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives in 2019 and is awaiting action in the Senate. AAUW was founded in 1881, and for over 130 years, AAUW has been a leading voice promoting equity and education for women and girls. We have over 170,000 members and 1,000 local branches, of which our Carbondale branch is one. Membership is open to anyone, male or female, holding an associate's or equivalent degree from a regionally accredited institution. Our mission statement is quite simple: advancing equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. We work locally to achieve our mission by providing scholarships to women students at SIU each year. Now, the national organization provides fellowships, grants, and awards. It has awarded over $115 million in fellowships and grants to more than 13,000 scholars and organizations. AAUW is one of the largest scholarship programs for women in the world. Also funds pioneering research on women, girls, and education. And through its legal advocacy fund, AAUW challenges sex discrimination in higher education and in the workplace. Our Carbondale branch was founded in 1927, and our ways of doing things have certainly changed and evolved during the intervening 93 years, but the core mission has remained the same: to advance gender equity for women and girls. We host monthly programs September through May, and everyone is welcome to attend any of our programs. We would also welcome anyone who shares our goals to join AAUW. Through a special program, anyone attending this event can do so at a much reduced introductory rate for the first year. If you're interested in joining or just getting more information, you may inquire through our Facebook page, Carbondale Branch AAUW, or send me an email, msellert@aol.com. Please contact me through email or through the Facebook page if you wish to receive notices of our programs. All of our branch meetings and programs are open to the public and all are welcome. Glad to have you with us this evening, and I will turn it back to our president, Ella Lacey, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Martha, for those comments. We are pleased to we're excited to bring you tonight's program, How Black Lives Matter Matters, Racial Justice and Police Reform, with speaker Catherine Field of the Racial Justice Coalition. I know you've heard a lot about national events lately, if no more than national elections. But what should recent national events have to do regarding our shared racial history for us here in Southern Illinois, even? Catherine Field is a coordinator of the Carbondale Racial Justice Coalition. She is a former probation officer and a university lecturer in deviance, criminal justice, and sociology of race. And she is nearing the end of her first term as a board member and secretary of the board of Carbondale Elementary School District number 95. A period that has been unmatched in history. When elections come next spring, remember that you heard her here and go out and vote in our local election. You have my word, it will be a lot simpler than our recent national elections. Remember, you heard Catherine Field here with AAUW. Catherine?
That's terrific. Thank you, Ella, for that. Martha, I wanted to say one thing. I'm a teacher and it's going to show. A college education does affect a woman's fertility. It doesn't necessarily impair. Impair is a loaded word with the specific historical and social context, but it does affect one's fertility. So anyway, hi, I am Kathy Field, and I'm very glad to be here tonight talking about some of my favorite topics. They are my favorite topics because they are so urgent. We are in a particular moment in history that we might call the fierce urgency of now. I didn't come up with that term, but it fits. Right now, we have an opportunity to make some changes that this country's been needing for a long time. And we have some ideas as to how that might happen. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. On this first slide, you see a picture there on the left, a young woman who's got a sign around her neck that says, Black Lives Matter. That was a photograph I took at a demonstration that the Carbondale Racial Justice Coalition organized back in 2014. The occasion for the event was a response to the authorities in Ferguson failing to indict Ferguson police for the killing of young Michael Brown. That was the first time that I saw the phrase Black Lives Matter. So I had to memorialize that with a photo. Next slide, please. A few ground rules before we get started talking about this. I used to teach race, as Ella said, and I would spend a whole semester on this stuff. Obviously, we don't have that kind of time, so we're going to have to narrow down what we are able to talk about tonight. Here are a few operating assumptions, just so you know where I'm coming from. These are things we will not be discussing. The fact that race is real. Yes, I know we're all children of God and the same inside, but we're going to be talking about race the way most people understand race. a difference in physical characteristics that are made meaningful in specific contexts. Similarly, racism is real. Systemic racism is even realer and even more of a problem. It's a problem because systemic racism, and you'll hear a lot about systemic racism these days. I believe President-elect Biden mentioned it in his speech Saturday night when he was talking about the major problems this country has and must tackle. These are practices that persist even if no one consciously intends them. And that's one of the more frustrating aspects of racism, is that everybody can be good-hearted and mean well, and racist practices still persist. We also believe that it is our moral duty to actively seek out these practices and attempt to eliminate them. And as I mentioned before, these are just operating assumptions, and we're going to act as if this is all true and move forward. Next slide, please. Here are a few things that we won't be talking about tonight, mostly because we don't have time. We won't be talking about how partisan politics affects racial justice, won't be talking about how capitalism affects racial justice or any other political or economic systems. We just don't have that kind of time. Obviously, these things matter. These things shape our social world. We just don't have time. We are also not going to talk about whether the police should be abolished. Sometimes when we get to talking about police reform, we are met with people who say, let's, eliminate the police and substitute care workers or whatever. Most of our membership believes that at this point in our evolutionary history, we need some form of policing, and that poor communities of color are most in need of good policing. So that's, again, an assumption we're working from and will not be discussing tonight. We similarly won't be talking about the social construction of crime and criminality, who decides what's a crime and who decides what the penalty should be. Again, no time. And finally, and this is important, we're not going to be talking about other people's motives or motivations. Very often, especially when you get to talking about social movements, other people want to say, oh, you're just doing that because, you just want to rebel against authority or whatever. No, that's motive mongering. We're not going to do that. We're not going to talk about other people's motives. We're not going to talk about other people's motivations. We're going to talk about what happens, how it happens, and what can be done to change it. Next slide, please. Oh, that was a photo of Sonia Ingebrigtsen, if you remember her. Pastor Sonia, she was one of the founders of Racial Justice Coalition. Hi, Sonia, we miss you. Okay, we're going to talk about what Black Lives Matter is, what it is not. We're going to talk about the fact that there are racial disparities in policing the United States, and that Carbondale is not immune. Some months ago, in some news story, the mayor said something to the effect that what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, oh, that could never happen in Carbondale. Not saying anyone would intend for it to happen, but we are not immune in Carbondale. We are fortunate to have had some professional leadership among our police who have some good common sense policies, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it could happen here. We're also going to talk about that, again, building on this current moment, we can use this political opportunity, and by political opportunity, I mean Black Lives Matter, to improve policing, to eliminate disparities, and to promote justice. And then finally, we're going to talk about of the different reform measures that are currently being proposed, which ones that we have talked about at the Racial Justice Coalition and which ones we think could work for Carbondale. Next slide, please. The first thing you have to know about Black Lives Matter is that Blackness matters. Blackness matters. This is a photo of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Birmingham jail. Why was he there? Next slide, please. The math is the math. It matters that you're Black in America. Why does it matter? The math tells us. According to the FBI, nearly 28% of all Americans who were arrested in 2019 were Black/African American. The US Census Bureau says, you know what that number should be? 13. That's over twice the amount that it should be. It's math. Next slide, please. What does it matter that you're more likely to get arrested if you're Black in Carbondale, in Illinois, in the United States of America? It sets up what we've come to call the pipeline. African Americans, if it's a metaphor, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, point one. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted. There's your second length of pipe. And then once convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. Boom. African American adults are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites. Does Blackness matter? Yes, Blackness matters a lot. Next slide, please. And here's the real power behind the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, it's a drag to be arrested. Yes, it's a drag to be convicted. Yes, it's a drag to go to prison. But here's the ultimate stake. Police violence is a leading cause of death for young men in the United States. Over the life course, about 1 in every 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by police. Now, you know 1,000 people, don't you? Imagine one of them lying in their own blood on the pavement. Next slide, please. I wanted to include the citation for that statistic, the risk of being killed by police use of force by age, race, ethnicity, and sex. I wanted to put that there because I understand they're going to archive this PowerPoint and somebody's going to want to look it up. Somebody's going to want to challenge these numbers. These numbers cannot be challenged. This is a real thing. You see the picture there, those it's kind of a takeoff on Norman Rockwell. The picture on the left is Norman Rockwell. You've got a friendly cop who sees a kid who's got, you know, a little hobo bag on a stick, and he's leaning over in a friendly, fatherly way. And at one time, I think that was a commonly held belief about police, that they were father figures who were helpful, and maybe some still are. But if you take a look at the figure on the right, what are we seeing? What we're seeing is a highly militarized version of that same photo. We see a man who could be going house to house in Iraq, looking for terrorists. And he's intimidating that small Black child. Am I trying to suggest that cops now are all going around terrorizing Black children? Not at all. But I am suggesting, and the research bears this out, that policing has changed. For one thing, we are seeing more veterans going into police work and law enforcement work. And secondly, we are also seeing more departments getting more militarized technology in order to do routine policing. We don't have time to go into that, but I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. A man dressed in battle gear is going to respond differently to a child than a man dressed in a blue uniform. Next slide, please. Black Lives Matter. Here's what it means. It means in the face of all these numbers that I've just thrown at you, don't look away. Do not let yourself look away. Next slide, please. When you look away, what you're saying is Black lives don't matter, that we can tolerate this much death, that these many destroyed lives, these many terrified children. We can. No, Black Lives Matter says don't do that. This is too important. They have lives like yours. They have inner lives. They have families. Next slide, please. A little excerpt from a book that I recommend to you by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He writes beautifully. Think of all the embraces, all the private jokes, customs, greetings, names, dreams, all the shared knowledge and capacity of a Black family injected into that vessel of flesh and bone. And think of how that vessel was taken, shattered on the concrete, and all its holy contents, all that had gone into him sent flowing back to earth. Next slide, please. You'll notice that I've included a number of photographs of different marches and rallies and events. These are all local things. I wanted to keep it local. I did not take all these photos. Some of them I just took off the internet. My apologies to the photographers. Because this is a local matter. Black Lives Matter. It recognizes the disparate impact of policing on the African-American community. Black Lives Matter demands something be done about it. And Black Lives Matter also points the way to fairer systems of justice. Next slide, please. Sociologists would classify Black Lives Matter as a social movement. It fits the definition of a social movement, just like the movement for abolition of slavery and the movement that we call civil rights. As a social movement, it is also connected to other movements working for justice for all, whether it's other social movements working for Black liberation, or Hispanic and immigrant rights, or rights for gay, lesbian, transgender. Here's something else I want you to understand clearly, because this is often obfuscated in public discussions. Black Lives Matter is loosely organized. It is decentralized. It is bound to local communities. In fact, there are 3 or 4 different organizations right here in Carbondale who all embrace Black Lives Matter, use it in their publications, their speeches, signs for their rallies and marches. That's how decentralized it is. Next slide, please. It's not the property of any single individual organization. You can't say, oh, Black Lives Matter believes this or Black Lives Matter believes that. No, it's Black Lives Matter belongs to everyone, and everyone's got different ideas. Some people who embrace Black Lives Matter are in favor of abolishing police. We are not. So you see what I mean when I say it's not the property of any one group. And there's no single organizing principle. There's no George Soros or anybody else pulling the strings and calling the shots. It is what the local groups make of it. It's also not ideologically opposed to any people. It's not opposed to white people, for example, although you will find individuals who don't think very highly of some groups or others. But again, it's an individual matter. It is also not ideologically opposed to the need for laws or law enforcement necessarily. Black Lives Matter is not here to make your life difficult. Yes, you might have to wait for the marchers to get out of the street. But the fact is, it's not here to make your life easy either. Why did they block the streets? Got your attention, huh? Don't look away. Next slide, please. Black Lives Matter is an idea whose time has come, most of all. Just like the Freedom Rides, as many of you maybe remember Genevieve Houghton from Carbondale. Genevieve was a dear friend of mine and one of the original Freedom Riders associated with a group called CORE in 1961. She was very nearly murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Anniston, Alabama. This photo is of a very young Genevieve standing next to the late Congressman, what's his name? John Lewis, yeah. Genevieve told me once that she thought that John Lewis was a nice man, but he'd never amount to much because he was too quiet. Next slide, please. Now, here's a thing you need to know about social movement ideas. They can move very quickly. This is why you hear a lot of talk about, oh, you know, there must be somebody calling the shots, somebody giving people their orders, because all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, people all over America were busting out into marches saying Black Lives Matter. Well, social movements do that sometimes. And I quoted a social movement scholar who talked about how this very thing happened during civil rights. It was people working independently of each other toward sort of the same goal, find out that other people are working toward the same goal too. And all of a sudden there's solidarity, and it was like a fever. It's not a fever. It's just an idea whose time has come. Next slide, please. Now, a word or two, if I may, about the Racial Justice Coalition itself. We formed in 2013 as a response to events that were happening back then, the killing of Trayvon Martin, the killing of Michael Brown, several other similar tragic events. We began to adopt the use of Black Lives Matter in 2014. We meet monthly, we discuss events, we plan strategies, we coordinate with others, individuals, groups, to promote racial justice here in Carbondale. And you can find us on Facebook, and at the end of the program, there'll be an email address if you want to get in touch with me about anything. Next slide, please. Other groups in Carbondale, I mentioned this before, they share our belief in Black Lives Matter. This particular rally was organized by some university students. Aren't they wonderful? I just love seeing young people believing change can happen and believing that change can make lives better. Next slide, please. This is a photo I took at an event that the District 95 teachers did. They were out on the streets with their Black Lives Matter signs a couple of times, 3 or 4 times this summer. Good for them. Next slide, please. Members of the Racial Justice Coalition meet fairly often with community leaders, including the leadership of the Carbondale Police Department. Police is not our only focus, but it is a big part of what we do. Next slide, please. The Carbondale Police Department, you will be happy to know, subscribes to the notion of fair treatment for all. They are a signatory to the NAACP's 10 shared principles, which is an important understanding and agreement spelled out in 10 steps. And you can read them at your leisure. We don't have time to go over them one by one, but understand that this was the result of a lot of good work by the NAACP first producing the document and then going around and distributing it to people who needed to sign on to it. Next slide, please. A few more things to know about the Carbondale Police Department. In 2019, they received 74,000 calls for service. And obviously, this ranges all the way from, you know, a kitty up a tree to homicide investigation. They also made 3,400 arrests. They used force in those arrests 313 times. And we're going to talk a little more about use of force. And they also kept, but did not share data related to race. This is a problem we have had with Carbondale Police Department ever since 2013. We would like to know specifically how many people in Carbondale who get arrested are Black or African American or Hispanic for that matter. But we do not have that information. Next slide, please. Carbondale Police Department has 60 sworn officers for a little less than 25,000 people. Remember, SIU has its own separate police force. So when you think about Carbondale Police, that's just for, you know, townies. A number of people, particularly people like Carbondale Spring, have been talking for months about the fact that other comparable cities have much smaller police forces. So I just gave you one here for comparison. For comparison, Bloomington, where ISU is, has twice the number of cops for 3 times the population. And if you look at other cities and the size of their police force, you might begin to think that maybe there's a pattern emerging here. Maybe we do have to take a look at the size of our police force. Okay, 90% of our Carbondale officers are white, even though minorities make up 42% of our population. Next slide, please. Recently, the Chief Grubbs, recently retired, invited representatives from Racial Justice Coalition, NAACP, and the Human Relations Commission to come to the police station and assist in the going over of their departmental policies for use of force, which we were glad to do. What we came away believing about this encounter is that there's some very professional policies at work, and we were glad to see it. You can read the list for yourself. No chokeholds, no strangleholds, no hog tying. What happened to George Floyd in Minnesota, if it did happen in Carbondale, would clearly have been a breach of policy and would have subjected the officer to consequences. Policy requires them to de-escalate whenever possible, to give verbal warnings before escalating use of force, exhaust all alternatives before shooting in particular. Officers have a duty to intervene if fellow officers are not following policy. Again, think about the George Floyd case. There were 3 other officers standing around watching the guy with his knee on George Floyd's neck. Under Carbondale policies, these officers would be subject to discipline also. No shooting at moving vehicles except to protect life. I mean, they can't shoot at a vehicle to stop a fleeing suspect, only to protect life. There's a use of force continuum. They have to use tasers when they can use tasers, pepper spray when they can safely use pepper spray, and so forth. In other words, use something else if something else will do. And they also require comprehensive reporting. Whenever there is a use of force, it has to be meticulously reported and also available for FOIA. Next slide, please. Now, here are some of the reforms that are being discussed in Carbondale and elsewhere. Many people are talking about reviewing the use of force policies, and this is good. This is good. You should know what your cops say about what their job is and how to do it before incidents come up. We had a few disagreements, and by we, I mean RJC, had a few disagreements with some of the policies. For example, the Carbondale Police Department uses pepper-based sprays to de-escalate a resistant subject, but they don't call that chemical. We call that chemical. It's not like, you know, pepper like you put on your tacos. Similarly, there was a policy that detailed that persons who exhibit extreme agitation, violent, irrational behavior accompanied by profuse sweating, extraordinary strength beyond their physical characteristics, and imperviousness to pain, who are suffering from what in law enforcement is known as excited delirium, may be at an increased risk of sudden death and should be considered medical emergencies, and therefore obviously must be taken into custody. And there's a lot of disagreement about professionals about that. Some see the whole idea of excited delirium as being another way in which, and there are many such examples, white people tend to overestimate the strength, size, and dangerousness of Black people, often with tragic consequences. And we ask them to take a look at that as part of their policies. As individuals too, we have reason to be suspicious of the uses of tasers in many cases, pepper sprays in many cases, and shooting in many cases. But again, it has to start with the policies. And even more than that, the leaders have to enforce the policies. You can have the best, most progressive policies in the world, but if they're not being followed, if the leadership is not forcing them to follow it, you might as well not have policies at all. There you've got a Wild West police force, and it requires Wild West solutions. Secondly, a reform being discussed in Carbondale and elsewhere. You'll hear these terms. People call for limiting qualified immunity to civil lawsuits. Qualified immunity, it's not so much a policy as it is a legal idea, an assumption that civil courts will make if people attempt to sue an officer for something the officer did in the pursuit of his or her duties. The courts are going to presume that the officer was acting in good faith unless there's clear evidence otherwise, and will grant immunity to civil lawsuits for almost all actions that an officer takes while wearing a uniform. And some people say, well, we need to change that to make officers more aware that not only can they be disciplined by their superiors, but they can also lose their house in a civil lawsuit if they don't respect people's constitutional rights. As I say, it's more of a legal doctrine than anything else, but it's something to be aware of. You should also know that it's embedded in labor contracts as well. So even if we were going to get rid of qualified immunity, it's very hard to get things out of a labor contract once it's in there. The reason being you have to be prepared to give away something else in order to get something in return. That's the nature of collective bargaining. All right, number 3, residency requirements. Currently, the city of Carbondale has no residency requirements except for the chief of police and maybe the assistant chief. I've forgotten now, but ordinary patrol officers do not have to live in Carbondale, and many of them don't. And this is one thing that we have talked about in Racial Justice Coalition. We would very much like to see police officers live in the communities that they serve. You can best serve people when you know them, and there's no better way to know them than to live with them, send your kids to school with them, see them in schnooks, invite them to the barbecue. You know what I'm talking about. We would very much like to see that. Can we make that happen? Maybe. The Chief Grubbs maintained that that would shrink the pool of eligible officers too much, that would eliminate a lot of qualified candidates. It's something we need to talk about, though. The city could sweeten the deal somehow to make it more attractive to officers to live in town. I'm going through these very quickly, so if you have questions, please write them down. Number 4, license or certify individual officers, much as we do teachers or nurses or anybody else. Now, you have to understand, Illinois already certifies officers. Illinois will tell Carbondale PD, for example, yes, this person is eligible to be a police officer. He or she has this education, this training, these certifications. What we don't have is a system of licensing, and it is something to think about. If an officer, an individual officer can, as a result of some kind of error of judgment, say, or maybe just bad behavior generally, could lose a license to work in that profession from now until the end of time, we think that that would make people stop and think about the consequences of their actions before they do it. It is something to discuss. It is something to think about. If we do it for nurses, why wouldn't we do it for cops? Nurses have to make split decisions over life and death all the time. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Number 5, use of body cameras or other similar technology. This is something that I personally don't think is very helpful for a number of reasons. One being that when you think about cases like Eric Garner in New York, who died of a chokehold after selling loose cigarettes on the street, it was filmed. The film was put on the internet. Everybody saw it. And you still heard people say, he had it coming. Similarly, George Floyd, again, somebody stood there with a video phone, videotaped his agonizing death, put it on the internet, and you still hear people saying, yeah, he had it coming. He had it coming. People don't believe films because they don't see them as they are. What's the old saying? We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. If people are inclined to believe police over everybody else, they can watch videos from now until the cows come home and still not budge, still not be moved. So that's one thing. Another thing, and this came from Chief Grubbs himself, he said, if we did have body cams, we would have to hire a whole new staff person just to keep these tapes, sort them, label them, archive them. Because if there are tapes, there will be subpoenas, there will be FOIAs. People will want these tapes and they have to be made available. And that would require at least one whole staff person. He said it would be logistically very difficult. And I can see that point as well. Oh, and in the last case, of course, and we have seen this, not in Carbondale, thank God, but we have seen cases where bad police officers accidentally forget to turn on their body cams. Oops. Let's see. Create a civilian review board. Here's the thing. We have the Human Relations Commission, which is supposed to pay attention to civilian complaints about police behavior. We do have a board that takes a look at hiring and firing cops. What we don't have is a board of civilians to do oversight of police behavior. For example, if the George Floyd incident had happened in Carbondale, it would have been investigated by, first of all, the police force itself, the supervisors, the leadership. Secondly, it might have gone to the Illinois State Police for their oversight, or it might have gone to the state's attorney's office for their oversight. In none of those steps are civilians involved. We think that civilians should be involved and that they should have the power to issue subpoenas and compel testimony. It can't all belong to the insiders. It can't all belong to the cops. Now, we had a conversation with the chief of police of Champaign, and we asked him what he thought of civilian review boards. And he said, well, the problem with that is when you've been working with the police long enough, you yourself, member of the Civilian Review Board, become an insider. And you lose that ability to look at it from the outside, which is, I think, what is needed. But I think that's a risk maybe we could take. And if enough people in Carbondale will it, the city manager said he would give some thought to it. Okay. Checking my time here. Yeah, I need to hurry up. Reduce the size of the force. As I said before, there is some evidence to suggest that we may be paying for more police than we actually need. I know there are a lot of service calls, but they don't all need to be answered by sworn officers. That's point one. And point two, Carbondale spends, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million a year on policing. That's the cost of the services, the cost of the equipment, the cost of personnel, and retirement costs, which in Illinois, you know, are high. $11 million a year for a town with a population between 20 and 25,000. That's a lot of money. And now with the pandemic, of course, city budgets are going to be stretched even further. It is something to talk about, and Carbondale Racial Justice Coalition thinks we could talk about that. And then the final one that I've listed there is increasing the number of Black officers and staff. Now, we at RJC think that's a good idea, but not because it will reduce the number of Black arrests, Black imprisonments, or Black deaths, because there's a lot of research that suggests it won't do those things. Oftentimes, officers of color are under pressure to show what? Loyalty to the force by doing the same things the white officers do. Arresting the same people under the same circumstances. And sadly, sometimes even being perpetrators or bystanders to death. Again, the George Floyd case is instructive in that regard. We do think there should be more Black officers, and we have consistently discussed that with the police here in Carbondale and asked for them. And the HR, director of HR is, I'm told, working on that very thing. Next slide, please. We are also, as a group, interested in some other police-related issues. We have consistently called for non-renewal of the school resource officer contracts at CCHS. That was the subject of a demonstration this summer. We have called publicly for a national search for a replacement for Chief Grubbs. Currently, the position is being held by Acting Chief Stan Reno, who's Carbondale born and raised. Nothing against Chief Reno, but we think that even the very act of putting the job listing out there, getting responses and talking to people will help the city to clarify what it wants from a police chief. And along those same lines, we also think that community groups need to be involved in the next, the hiring of the next police chief. It doesn't necessarily have to be us, but we're willing to serve as our other members from other groups. Community involvement is key. It matters very much who the chief of police is. As I said a few minutes ago, all the policies in the world won't help if the leadership doesn't see to it that those policies are enforced. Next slide, please. I wanted to close the slide presentation with this photo once again. The reason being, you see over the shoulder of that young woman, that little white boy kind of peeping out of the backpack there. I wanted him in this presentation because I think it's important for him to grow up learning that we don't live in a just world, but we should live in a just world. We want to live in a just world, and that he can be part of that. He must be part of that. We're depending on him to be part of that. That's my little grandson. Isn't he cute? And that concludes that part of my presentation, and I'm ready for questions. Dr. Flowers? Hi.
I'm here.
Hi.
You must have done a very, very good job on your presentation. And in the Q&A, the only thing that's there is saying that it is a very good presentation. So at this point,
Well,
there's nothing in the Q&A and nothing in the chat other than very articulate presentation.
well, thank you very much.
So, questions, people?
Yeah. I've got more material here. I mean, yeah, look, I'm a teacher. I can talk at the drop of the hat. Don't make me talk at the drop of the hat. Make me talk about what you're interested in.
How about if you have a question, you unmute yourself and ask it? Would that work?
No.
No, they can't unmute themselves.
Ah.
But it looks like one maybe showed up in the Q&A.
Okay, here's a question. How is racial justice working within AACP and other local groups for police reform?
Yeah. Good question. We are working with them every chance we get. The NAACP, you have to understand, is the oldest and most venerable civil rights organization in this country. There is no one who can hold a candle to them for longevity, perseverance against all the odds, and prestige. And we would never try to. We work with them by attending events together. We attend their events, they attend our events. Ella and I are both members of the NAACP as well as Racial Justice Coalition. And we consider the groups to be compatible in terms of aims, vision, and action. So every chance we get, we support them and they support us.
Okay.
The next question. Why do we say not all cops need to answer calls, and also say we shouldn't abolish the police?
Okay. Yeah, this is a complex idea. People, when the chief told us that what did I say? It was like 74,000 calls every year, ranging from kitty up a tree to homicide. The first thing we did was we said, are you sure about that number? That's a very large number. And we were told, yes, and that's why we need the size police force we have, because the community demands it. So the idea that I'm introducing there is the idea that many of those calls, even if they go through the telecommunicators, can best be handled by non-sworn personnel, by community workers, mental health workers, other city employees. The idea being we don't necessarily have to have a highly trained and heavily armed officer to answer routine calls. It's a way of looking at force reduction and also looking at a way of reducing the number of police encounters with civilians who might not be in the most cooperative frame of mind, right? Sometimes a mental health worker can de-escalate someone who's having a psychotic break much more safely and without anyone being hurt. That's what I'm talking about. And I also say we shouldn't abolish the police. And I mostly am saying that because that's the consensus of my organization. But on a very personal level, I have to tell you something. Back when I was a probation officer, there wasn't nearly the number of guns that there are now. The amount of guns in this country, both licensed and unlicensed, is staggering. You don't even want to know how many, nobody even knows how many guns there are. There are so many guns. And until this country has done nothing about that problem except watch it grow since the 1990s. That was the last time this country seriously addressed the issue of all these guns. And it's high time that we addressed it again. And in the meantime, because there are so many guns out there, I personally want some good guys with guns in the employ of the city of Carbondale. So I gave you both the organizational answer and my own personal answer.
One last question.
So here was a follow-up to that.
Uh-huh.
As a follow-up, does that mean we have half police and half social workers on the force? Every police officer has a social worker as a partner.
Some municipalities have been trying out models like that. There's, I think the classic example is Eugene, Oregon has a pilot program where that's exactly what they're doing. They are pairing care workers with sworn officers as needed, or just sending out care workers when in the judgment of the emergency personnel, a care worker can do as good, if not a better job. There are municipalities piloting this, and you're going to see more in the future, and we'll have the advantage of seeing what works and what doesn't going forward by continuing to watch this.
Dr. Flowers, thank you very much, but I have to take President's prerogative and try to get us out on time.
Yeah, you certainly.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Thank you. We certainly thank Catherine Field for this most thought-provoking and well-done presentation. We also thank the Carbondale Public Library under the leadership of Dinah Brawley Sussman for being the Zoom experts that they are and for assisting us, most ably with our presentations. And we thank our audience for attending, for listening and interacting, and for coming up with some very good questions at the end. We implore the audience to join in the community efforts that are going on and try to make our community a better place in this world in the middle of so many difficult situations. And the last note, I want to remind you of our next program, which is Tuesday, December 8th, same time, 7 p.m., same format, Zoom, with Dr. Glenn Pashard, a past president of SIU. He will be our featured speaker in a program on leadership from within. We hope you will join us for that program and as often as you can in the future. Again, thank you and good night.